If you spend enough years delivering mail, you begin to know people without ever really speaking to them. You know who wakes before sunrise? Who always leaves biscuits on the porch for stray dogs? Which homes smell like fresh bread? Which windows never open? You notice things, small things, the sort of details everyone else walks past. Harold Benson had been a mail carrier for nearly 40 years. By the time he retired, he could have walked his entire route blindfolded. He knew every crooked fence, every cracked mailbox, every old oak tree whose roots had begun to swallow the road beneath it. He often joked that he could tell what season it was simply by the smell of the wind drifting through Maple Hollow. People trusted him. Children waved whenever they saw his little white mail truck. Elderly couples invited him inside during heavy storms. He attended weddings, funerals, birthday parties, not because he was family, because after 4 decades, he had quietly become part of everyone's routine. There was only one house that never changed. It sat almost 3 miles beyond the last occupied farm, where the road narrowed into little more than packed dirt. The mailbox leaned sideways, paint peeled from the wooden walls. The porch sagged under its own weight. Nature had slowly begun reclaiming the place. Everyone simply called it the Ashcroft Farm. Nobody had lived there in nearly 25 years. The last owner, Eleanor Ashcroft, had passed away during an especially harsh winter. She had no children, no close relatives. The property remained exactly as she'd left it. Nobody bought it, nobody visited. It simply grew older. Every year vines climbed a little higher along the porch. Every autumn another section of roof disappeared beneath fallen leaves. Yet something peculiar began happening shortly after Harold's retirement. Every December, one letter appeared in his mailbox. Not his personal mailbox. The old leather satchel he'd kept in the attic. The one he hadn't touched since leaving the postal service. At first he assumed he'd forgotten it there years ago. Perhaps it had slipped beneath the lining. Old bags collect strange things. Coins, receipts, buttons, even letters. He unfolded the envelope. The paper felt strangely new, cream-colored, perfectly sealed. The handwriting looked elegant, carefully practiced, as though every letter had been written with patience. The address read, Eleanor Ashcroft, Ashcroft Farm, Maple Hollow. There was no return address, no postage stamp, no postal markings, nothing, just the name. Harold frowned. He placed it on the kitchen table and forgot about it, or at least he tried to. The following December, another envelope appeared, identical, same handwriting, same paper, same destination. Again, no stamp, no sender, no explanation. His wife laughed. You probably missed one before retiring, but Harold knew that wasn't true. Mail carriers remember unusual addresses, especially abandoned ones. Still, curiosity has a way of growing slowly, like ivy, quietly, patiently, until one day you realize it's covering everything. On a gray December morning, Harold climbed into his old pickup truck and drove toward Ashcroft Farm. The road looked smaller than he remembered. Trees had grown closer together. Branches arched overhead, turning daylight into a soft green tunnel. When he arrived, the house stood exactly as memory had preserved it. Silent, weathered, waiting. He stepped carefully onto the porch. Every floorboard groaned beneath his boots. Dust coated the windows so thickly that the rooms beyond looked underwater. He hesitated only a moment before sliding the envelope through the rusted mail slot beside the front door. It disappeared into darkness. That should have been the end of it. But as Harold turned back toward his truck, he noticed something. Fresh footprints. One pair, small, leading away from the porch. They crossed the frozen yard before disappearing into the woods behind the house. He stared for several seconds. The snow everywhere else remained untouched. Only those footprints, perfectly clear, as though someone had walked there only moments earlier. He considered following them. Instead, he drove home. Old age teaches you an important lesson. Not every question needs answering, but some questions refuse to leave you alone. The next December, the letter came again. Only this time, the envelope felt heavier. Harold carefully opened it. Inside, there was another envelope, older, yellow with age. Its edges had begun crumbling. Across the front, written in faded ink, were 3 simple words. returned to sender. Harold had never seen it before. And yet, something about the handwriting made the room suddenly feel much colder. There are places that seem ordinary until someone tells you their history. A road becomes the site of an accident. An empty field was once a neighborhood. An old tree once held a swing. And suddenly, you never look at that place the same way again. Hollow Lake was one of those places. It wasn't famous. It wasn't particularly beautiful. Most people driving through the county barely noticed it. A narrow stretch of water surrounded by tall pine trees, with a weathered wooden dock and a single green bench facing the shore. Nothing more, nothing less. But if you asked anyone over 60 about that bench, they would all grow quiet. The first person to tell me about it was an old fisherman named Walter. He was the sort of man who never wasted words. His hands were rough from decades of pulling fishing nets, and his face carried the kind of wrinkles only years of sunlight can carve. Every Saturday morning, he'd sit outside the town bakery with a cup of black coffee. Most people walked past him without a second glance. I didn't. Old people often carry the best stories. They simply wait for someone patient enough to listen. One rainy morning, I asked him why nobody ever sat on the green bench by Hollow Lake. He looked at me for several seconds, not surprised, almost disappointed, like he'd hoped nobody would ask anymore. Finally, he smiled to himself. "You know," he said softly, "there used to be 2 benches." I frowned. He nodded. There were 2, but only one was ever empty. Nearly 40 years earlier, Hollow Lake had been far livelier. Families picnicked there every summer. Children skipped stones across the water. Teenagers carved their initials into the dock. Every evening, elderly couples walked slowly around the shoreline before heading home. Among them were Arthur and Evelyn. Everyone knew them. Arthur had worked as the town clockmaker. Evelyn taught music at the local primary school. Neither of them was particularly remarkable on their own, but together, they seemed inseparable. Every evening at precisely 6 o'clock, Arthur would arrive carrying 2 cups of tea. Evelyn would already be waiting on the bench. They'd sit together until sunset. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Apparently, after 30 years of marriage, silence had become its own language. The townspeople smiled whenever they passed. Some things become part of a place. Arthur and Evelyn were one of them. Then one autumn, everything changed. Evelyn was diagnosed with an illness. The details weren't important. Only the ending was. Within 6 months, she was gone. Arthur stopped repairing clocks. Stopped attending church. Stopped answering his front door. Neighbors brought food. He rarely touched it. Some mornings they saw him standing at his living room window long before sunrise, simply staring outside, as though waiting for something, or someone. Then, exactly 1 week after Evelyn's funeral, Arthur returned to Hollow Lake. 6 o'clock. Like always, he carried 2 cups of tea. He placed one beside him on the bench. The other he held between his hands. People assumed it was grief, a routine he'd eventually outgrow, but he came back the next day, and the day after that, every evening. 6 o'clock. 2 cups, one untouched. Winter arrived. Snow covered the shoreline. The lake froze solid. Still, Arthur came. Spring returned. Birds nested in the trees. Flowers bloomed. Still, Arthur came. Years passed. Nothing changed. The tea always grew cold. The second cup always remained untouched. Children who had grown up watching him eventually became adults. To them, Arthur sitting alone had simply become part of Hollow Lake. No stranger ever questioned it. The locals never explained. Some grief deserves privacy. Then something peculiar began happening. It started with photographs. Tourists occasionally took pictures of the lake. Nothing unusual. Until one young couple developed their vacation film. In every photograph, Arthur appeared exactly as expected, sitting alone, holding 1 cup. But, on the empty side of the bench, there was the faint outline of someone else. Not clearly, just enough to resemble a woman in a light-colored coat. The photographer blamed a camera fault. Double exposure, old film. It happened. Nobody thought much of it, until another family visited the following year. Different camera, different film, different season. The same figure appeared again, always seated beside Arthur, never looking at the camera, always facing the lake. Walter paused his story long enough to finish his coffee. Outside, the rain had become heavier. People hurried past the bakery carrying umbrellas. None of them noticed the silence between us. "You believe that?" I finally asked. Walter shrugged. "Doesn't matter if I do. The pictures existed." Arthur grew older. His hair turned white. His steps became slower. But 6 o'clock never changed. Neither did the 2 cups of tea. Eventually, the town council decided to replace the old benches. The wood had begun rotting. One morning, workers arrived with trucks. They removed both benches. By evening, someone had carried one of them back. No one admitted doing it. It simply reappeared, exactly where Arthur always sat. The workers laughed. The next day, they removed it again. The following morning, it was back. This happened 4 times. Eventually, the council gave up. Sometimes practical people know when to stop asking questions. Arthur died quietly in his sleep one November evening. The town held a small funeral. People shared stories. They spoke about clocks, about kindness, about patience. But most of all, they talked about Hollow Lake. Everyone assumed the bench would finally be empty. The following evening, a young jogger passing the lake called the police. He reported seeing an elderly man sitting alone by the water after dark. Officers arrived minutes later. Nobody was there. Only 2 steaming cups of tea resting on the bench. One half empty, the other untouched. Walter looked down into his empty cup. "I didn't believe it either," he admitted. "So I went there myself. Every evening for a week." I leaned closer. "And?" He smiled sadly. "Nothing. Just an old bench." He stood slowly, adjusting his worn jacket. But on the 8th evening, I got there late. The tea was already warm. Walter died 3 winters later. Heart failure. A peaceful passing, they said. The sort everyone hopes for. A month after his funeral, I happened to drive past Hollow Lake on my way home. It was almost sunset. The sky had turned the color of old copper. For reasons I still can't explain, I pulled over. The lake was perfectly still. No birds. No wind. No voices. Just the quiet rhythm of water touching the shore. The green bench was exactly where Walter said it would be. Old, weathered, covered in fallen pine needles, completely empty. I almost turned back. Then I noticed something resting near one end of the bench. A ceramic cup, still giving off thin curls of steam. Beside it, another cup, cold, untouched. I never went back, not because I was frightened, but because some places belong to memories far older than ourselves. And perhaps, it's kinder to let them keep their company. Every town has that one house. Not abandoned, not exactly haunted, just forgotten. The kind of place people point toward when they're giving directions. Turn left at the old blue house. Keep driving until you pass the place with the broken fence. Nobody remembers who lives there anymore. Eventually, the house becomes older than anyone's memory. The story I'm about to tell begins in one of those houses. And unlike most stories, nobody can agree on how it ended. The town of Briar's End sat between 2 forests and a slow-moving river. It was quiet enough that strangers stood out immediately. Mail arrived late. The church bell still rang every Sunday. Children rode bicycles until the streetlights came on. People left their doors unlocked. Nothing much ever happened there, which is probably why everyone noticed the light. Every night, without fail, at exactly 7 o'clock, the porch light of the old Mercer house switched on. At exactly 11, it switched off. Not a minute early, not a minute late. Rain, snow, power outages, storms, it didn't matter. The light always came on, always went off, like clockwork. At first, nobody thought much of it. After all, someone probably lived there, even if nobody ever saw them. The Mercer family had once been well known around town. Thomas Mercer was a carpenter. His wife Alice ran the local library. They had one son, Daniel. Neighbors described them as ordinary, happy. The sort of family that waved from their porch whenever someone walked by. Then, one winter evening, Daniel disappeared. He was only 9 years old. One moment he was playing in the snow behind the house. The next, he was gone. The police searched for weeks. Volunteers combed the forests. The river was dragged. Every nearby town received missing person posters. Nothing. No footprints. No clothing. No answers. It was as though the earth had quietly swallowed him whole. People often say time heals. I don't think that's true. Time simply teaches people how to carry pain without letting everyone else see it. Thomas never smiled the same way again. Alice stopped opening the library. The curtains remained closed. Visitors became less frequent. Years passed. Then one day, Thomas died of a heart attack while repairing a neighbor's roof. Alice was left alone. Entirely alone. For the next 15 years, she hardly left the house. The grocery store delivered food. The mailman left letters beneath the mat. Children whispered stories about the lonely woman behind the curtains. But every evening, at exactly 7, the porch light came on. Neighbors assumed it was habit. Nothing more. Old people become creatures of routine. Alice died quietly during the spring. She was 83. The funeral was small. Most people attending barely knew her. The house was locked. The electricity was scheduled to be disconnected. The town slowly forgot about the Mercers. Until 3 nights later, at exactly 7 o'clock, the porch light turned on. At 11, it switched off. People assumed the electric company hadn't shut the power off yet. A simple mistake. Mistakes happen. But then another week passed. Another month. The bills remained unpaid. The house was empty. Yet every evening, the light obeyed the same schedule. The electric company sent technicians. They inspected the meter. The power had already been disconnected. There was no electricity reaching the house. None. The technician reportedly laughed. There must be another source. He searched the attic, the basement, every wall. Nothing. No generator. No battery. No hidden wiring. No explanation. Eventually, curiosity overcame fear. A group of teenagers decided to spend the night inside. They wanted proof. Ghosts. Squatters. Anything. They entered just before sunset. Flashlights. Sleeping bags. A cheap disposable camera. One of them later described the house as strangely untouched. Dust covered everything. Family photographs still hung on the walls. A toy train sat beneath the staircase. A dinner table remained set for 3 people, as if someone had simply stepped outside and forgotten to come back. 7 o'clock arrived. The porch light turned on. The teenagers were standing inside the living room. They heard no footsteps, no switches, no sounds, only the faint click of the bulb outside. One of them rushed to the front door. The switch was still in the OFF position. He flipped it up. Nothing changed. He flipped it down. Still nothing. The light outside continued glowing. Steady. Warm. Impossible. Around 9 that evening, one of the boys wandered upstairs. He later claimed he heard someone humming, very softly, an old lullaby. He assumed one of his friends was playing a joke. Instead, he found an empty bedroom. Except, the rocking chair near the window was moving. Slowly. Back and forth. Back and forth. There wasn't a breeze. The windows were closed. He didn't tell the others until years later, because even he wasn't sure he'd actually seen it. At exactly 11, the porch light switched off. The entire house became completely dark. Not just dark. Silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The teenagers left before midnight. None of them ever spent another night there. Years passed. Developers eventually purchased the property. The old Mercer house was demolished. Brick by brick. Beam by beam. By autumn, nothing remained except an empty patch of earth. People assumed the story had finally ended. They were wrong. Because every evening, at exactly 7, the empty lot began glowing. There was no house, no porch, no light fixture. Just a square of warm yellow light hanging in the darkness exactly where the front door had once been. Visible from the road, visible from neighboring houses. It remained until 11, then disappeared. Every night, without fail, the town council fenced off the property. Children were told not to play there. Most people simply avoided looking. After enough years, even impossible things become ordinary. The glowing patch of light became another part of Briar's End. Like the church, the river, the bakery. People stopped asking questions. I visited the town myself nearly 20 years ago. The lot was still empty. Grass had grown where the house once stood. Wildflowers covered most of the ground. Nothing seemed unusual. An elderly woman sweeping her porch noticed me staring. "You waiting for 7?" she asked. I nodded. She smiled sadly. "Most visitors do." "What happens?" She rested both hands on her broom. "Nothing. You'll just see the light." "And that's all?" She looked toward the empty field. "No." After a long silence, she added, "If you're standing close enough, you'll smell someone's supper cooking." I laughed. She didn't. I stayed. 7 o'clock arrived. Exactly on time. A soft golden light appeared over the empty grass. Not bright, not blinding. Just enough to suggest a porch that no longer existed. The air remained perfectly still. Then, without warning, a smell drifted past me. Fresh bread. Roasted chicken. Something sweet. Apple pie, perhaps. The sort of meal families used to eat together before television filled every quiet moment. It lasted only a few seconds. Then it was gone. The light remained until 11. Just as everyone had said. I've thought about that evening many times since. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe someone nearby was cooking. Maybe the mind plays tricks when it expects something strange. Or maybe, some homes are built from more than wood and brick. Maybe they're built from the thousands of ordinary evenings shared inside them. The laughter, the arguments, the birthdays, the bedtime stories, the smell of dinner drifting through an open window, and perhaps, when enough love is left behind in one place, a small part of it refuses to leave. So every night, at exactly 7 o'clock, for just 4 quiet hours, someone somewhere still leaves the porch light on. Bedtime. There was once a train station so small that most maps never bothered to print its name. It sat between 2 hills, surrounded by thick forests that swallowed sound whenever the wind stopped blowing. Only 4 trains passed through each day. The platform was little more than cracked concrete, a faded wooden bench, and an old clock that had lost nearly all of its paint. People didn't come there because they wanted to. They came because they had somewhere else to be. For years, that station remained exactly the same, until one man gave people a reason to remember it. His name was Samuel Reed. At least, that's what the station master told me. He wasn't famous. He hadn't fought in any wars. He wasn't a politician or a wealthy businessman. He had spent nearly 40 years repairing watches in a neighboring town before quietly retiring. After his wife died, he sold his little workshop, packed a single suitcase, and disappeared from everyone's life. Months later, he began appearing at Blackwood Station, every single evening, 5 minutes before the 6 o'clock train, always wearing the same dark overcoat, always carrying the same worn leather suitcase, always standing beside the same weathered bench. He never boarded. He never spoke. When the train arrived, he'd simply watch every passenger step off, his eyes carefully searching every face. When the platform emptied, he'd nod to himself, turn around, and walk home. The first few days, nobody thought much of it. Perhaps he was waiting for a relative, a friend, someone delayed by bad weather. It happened. People waited. Life got in the way. A week passed, then another. Samuel never missed a day. Rain soaked his coat. Summer heat made the platform shimmer. Snow buried the tracks. Still, 5 minutes before 6, he arrived, and when the train departed, he left alone. Eventually, the station master introduced himself. "You expecting someone?" Samuel smiled politely. "My wife." The station master hesitated. "I hope she's not too late." Samuel looked toward the tracks. "She promised she'd come home." That was all he said. People assumed she must have been traveling, maybe visiting family, maybe recovering somewhere. Nobody wanted to pry. Small towns understand that grief often wears strange clothes. Months turned into years. The station changed. The old ticket office closed. New electronic signs replaced faded timetables. Steam locomotives became diesel. Diesel eventually gave way to sleek modern trains. Samuel never changed. Every evening, 5 minutes before 6, same suitcase, same bench, same quiet smile. Children who had once waved at him grew into adults. Some left town, others returned years later with families of their own. Whenever they passed through Blackwood Station, Samuel was still there, watching, waiting. One autumn evening, a young conductor finally gathered enough courage to ask him, "Sir, Who exactly are you waiting for? Samuel opened the suitcase resting beside his feet. Inside, there wasn't any clothing, no travel supplies, only a carefully folded blue scarf, a tiny music box, a faded black and white photograph, and 2 train tickets, dated October 17th. The conductor looked confused. Samuel gently touched the photograph. We were supposed to leave together. He smiled, though it wasn't really a smile anymore. She missed the train. That was the entire story. Or so everyone believed. Until the station master decided to look through the old archives. Railway offices keep records of everything. Ticket sales, accidents, delays, maintenance reports. If something happened, someone usually wrote it down. He found an article buried in an old newspaper. October 17, 1968. A landslide had struck the railway just outside Blackwood. The evening train never reached its destination. 34 people died. Among them, Emily Reed, Samuel's wife. The station master frowned. Something didn't make sense. If Emily had died on the train, why had Samuel always said, "She missed the train"? He searched further. Another report. A witness statement. According to several passengers, Emily had been running toward the platform carrying a blue scarf. Samuel had already boarded. She smiled. He smiled back. Then, just before she reached the train, she stopped, turned around, and ran toward a crying little girl standing alone near the ticket office. The child had wandered too close to the tracks. Emily pulled her back just as another freight train thundered through. By the time she reached the platform again, Samuel's train had already departed. She waved. He waved back, smiling, certain he'd see her that evening, because she had bought the ticket for the next train, the one that never arrived. The station master closed the newspaper. Suddenly, Samuel's words made perfect sense. She hadn't died on his train. She had missed it. He never told Samuel what he'd found. There seemed little point. Some truths arrived too late to comfort anyone. Years continued slipping quietly by. Samuel became slower. His hair turned completely white. His hands trembled whenever winter arrived. Still, every evening, 5 minutes before 6, he waited. Some passengers began waving to him from the train windows. Others left flowers on the bench. Nobody laughed anymore. Waiting had become part of who he was. One December afternoon, heavy snow forced every train in the region to stop operating. Announcements echoed across empty platforms. All services canceled until further notice. Blackwood Station became silent. The station master assumed Samuel wouldn't come. For the first time in decades, there was no train to meet. At exactly 5:55, Samuel walked onto the platform. Same suitcase, same coat, same calm expression. The station master hurried outside. "Samuel, there aren't any trains tonight." Samuel smiled kindly. "I know. Then why did you come?" He looked toward the snow-covered tracks. "Because she doesn't know." The station master later admitted that was the closest he'd ever come to crying at work. Samuel passed away the following spring. A heart attack. Peaceful. At home, the town attended his funeral. The old suitcase was buried beside him, along with the blue scarf, the photograph, and the 2 unused train tickets. Blackwood Station carried on. New passengers, new schedules, new faces. Time has a habit of replacing everything, almost everything. Several years later, the station master retired. His replacement was a young woman named Clara. She had never heard Samuel's story. To her, Blackwood was simply another quiet station. One evening, a little before closing, she noticed something unusual on the security cameras. An elderly man stood alone beside the old wooden bench. Dark overcoat, leather suitcase. She assumed someone had missed the train. By the time she walked outside, the platform was empty. No footsteps, no luggage, no one. She checked the recording. The man was still there, standing perfectly still, looking down the tracks. Then, just before the camera timestamp reached 6 p.m., another figure appeared beside him. A woman wearing a long coat, a blue scarf wrapped around her neck. She slipped her hand into his. Neither of them looked toward the station. They looked only at each other. As the train pulled into the platform, the camera flickered for barely a second. When the picture returned, both of them were gone. The train doors opened. Passengers stepped off. Life continued. No one else seemed to notice. I visited Blackwood Station not long after hearing the story. The bench is still there. Older now. Its paint almost completely gone. The station master who told me everything has long since passed away. The clock has been replaced. The ticket office is now a coffee stand. Most people walking through have never heard of Samuel Reed. To them, it's just another forgotten station. Sometimes I wonder if that's how love disappears. Not all at once, but slowly. First, the people who knew your story leave. Then the places change. Then your name fades from memory. Until one day, all that's left is an old bench, a passing train, and a feeling that someone, somewhere, is still waiting for the person they promised they'd never stop looking for. There are some sounds you never really forget. The creak of the stairs in the house where you grew up. The whistle of an old kettle. The laughter of someone who's been gone for years. And then, there are sounds that stay with you because they should have been impossible. This is one of those stories. Long before mobile phones became something everyone carried in their pocket, every house on Cedar Street had a telephone fixed to the wall. They were heavy, cream-colored, the kind with a rotary dial that clicked softly as it turned back into place. Children would sit on the kitchen floor drawing circles with the phone cord while their parents spoke to relatives for hours. Back then, a ringing telephone meant something. Nobody called just to pass the time. If the phone rang after midnight, people's hearts sank before they even answered. At the very end of Cedar Street stood a modest little brick house with white shutters and a narrow front porch. Nothing remarkable about it, except for the elderly man who lived there. His name was Edward Collins. Most people simply called him Mr. Collins. He had worked as a high school history teacher for nearly 40 years. The sort of teacher who remembered every student's name long after they'd forgotten his. He lived alone. His wife, Margaret, had died nearly 2 decades earlier. They'd never had children, just each other. Neighbors often worried about him, not because he seemed unhappy, because he seemed finished, as though the best part of his life had quietly packed its bags years ago. Still, he was kind. Every morning he'd sweep his front steps. Every Tuesday he'd buy flowers for Margaret's grave. Every December he'd decorate his little porch with the same faded string of warm yellow lights. Routine became his way of surviving. One Christmas Eve, just after 9 o'clock, his telephone rang. He answered without looking. "Hello." Silence. Then, very softly, a woman laughed. Not loudly, just enough for him to freeze. It wasn't the laugh itself. It was the way it ended. Margaret always laughed twice. A small laugh, then another quieter one. Exactly like the voice on the phone. Edward didn't speak. Neither did the caller. After nearly 30 seconds, the line went dead. He assumed someone had dialed the wrong number. Or perhaps grief had simply made him imagine things. Loneliness has a strange way of filling silence with memories. He went to bed, told no one. The following Christmas Eve, at exactly 9:07, the phone rang again. Edward stared at it for several moments before answering. "Hello?" Again. Silence. Then the same quiet laugh, this time followed by a whisper. "Merry Christmas." Click. The line disconnected. Edward immediately called the telephone operator. No incoming call had been registered. According to their records, his phone had never rung. He told himself there had to be an explanation. Faulty wiring, old equipment, someone playing a cruel joke. But none of those explanations felt right. Because the voice hadn't simply sounded like Margaret. It had sounded comfortable. The way people speak when they're finally home after a long journey. Years pass. Every Christmas Eve, 9:17, the phone rang. Always once. Always the same voice. Never more than a few words. Sometimes, "I miss the snow." Sometimes, "You remembered the lights." Sometimes, "Don't forget your scarf." Little things. Ordinary things. The sort of comments only someone who had shared a life with him would think to say. Edward never told anyone. Who would believe him? He barely believed himself. Instead, he began preparing. Every Christmas Eve he'd make 2 cups of tea. One for himself, one that slowly grew cold beside the telephone. He'd sit in his old armchair from 8:30 onward, reading the same history book, pretending not to watch the clock. Eventually, his hearing began to fade. Age has a way of stealing little things before it takes the bigger ones. Friends noticed he often asked people to repeat themselves. The television became louder every year, but somehow, he never missed the call. Even when he struggled to hear conversations face to face, Margaret's voice always sounded perfectly clear. One winter afternoon, a young electrician named Ben visited to replace some aging wiring. Edward mentioned, almost jokingly, "I suppose you'll finally fix my Christmas phone." Ben laughed. "What Christmas phone?" Edward told him everything. Not dramatically, just matter-of-factly. The way someone describes an old family tradition. Ben smiled politely. He assumed the old man was lonely. Nothing more. Before leaving, he replaced every wire connected to the telephone, installed a brand new handset, even checked the connection outside. Everything was perfect. "Well," Ben said, "if it rings now, it won't be because of old wiring." Christmas Eve arrived. Ben found himself thinking about the conversation. Out of curiosity, he parked across the street just before 9. The porch lights glowed softly beneath a layer of fresh snow. Edward sat alone by the front window, exactly as he'd described, waiting. At precisely 9:17, Ben saw Edward reach for the telephone. He answered, listened, smiled, then quietly began to cry. Not with grief, with relief. When Edward finally hung up, Ben crossed the street. He knocked gently. Edward opened the door, still wiping tears from his eyes. "Did it ring?" Ben asked. Edward nodded. "What did she say?" Edward looked toward the telephone, then back at the young man. "She asked if I'd been eating properly." Ben chuckled. "Sounds like a wife." Edward smiled. "Yes, it does." Ben examined the phone. No missed calls, no incoming record, nothing. He checked the telephone exchange the following morning. According to their system, Edward's line had remained completely inactive all evening. Time continued its quiet march. Edward grew weaker. Walking became difficult. His world slowly shrank to the distance between his bedroom, his kitchen, and the armchair beside the telephone. Neighbors often brought meals. Ben stopped by every few weeks just to talk. Neither of them ever mentioned the Christmas calls again. Some things don't survive being explained. One December, Edward failed to decorate the porch. The yellow lights remained in the attic. His front steps gathered snow. Neighbors grew concerned. Ben visited. Edward answered after several minutes. He looked impossibly tired. "I don't think," he whispered. "I'll make it to next Christmas." Ben didn't know what to say, so he simply made them both tea. They sat together for nearly an hour, mostly in silence. Before leaving, Ben noticed Edward gently dusting the old telephone with a cloth, as though preparing it for a guest. Christmas Eve arrived beneath the quietest snowfall anyone could remember. Cedar Street looked almost untouched. No children outside, no passing cars, just soft white silence. At 8:50 that evening, Ben walked to Edward's house carrying a small tin of homemade cookies. The porch lights were glowing again. Someone had hung them. He smiled. Perhaps the old man had found the strength after all. He knocked. No answer. The front door wasn't locked. Ben stepped inside. The fire still burned softly. 2 cups of tea rested on the table. Steam no longer rose from either. The telephone sat quietly on the wall. Edward was asleep in his chair, a peaceful expression on his face, one hand resting gently beside the receiver. The doctor later said he'd passed away only minutes earlier. No pain, no fear, just quietly, exactly the way he'd hoped. The funeral was held a few days after New Year's. It was small. Former students came from neighboring towns. People shared stories about the teacher who had inspired them to love history. Ben attended too. He couldn't stop thinking about the empty house, or the old telephone still hanging in the kitchen. The property remained vacant until spring. Eventually, Edward's belongings were sorted, furniture donated, books boxed away. The telephone, still attached to the wall. The buyers planned to renovate everything. The first thing to go would be the old phone. Technology had moved on. Nobody wanted a rotary telephone anymore. On the evening before construction began, the foreman stayed late finishing paperwork inside the empty house. Outside, snow began falling again. At exactly 19, the telephone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. He frowned, curious more than frightened. He lifted the receiver. "Hello?" A long silence answered him. Then, very gently, a woman spoke. "Thank you." The foreman looked around the empty kitchen. "Who's this?" Another pause, then one final sentence. "He's not alone anymore." The line went dead. When the workers arrived the next morning, the foreman had already removed the telephone from the wall. He wrapped it carefully in an old blanket. Instead of throwing it away, he carried it to the local historical museum. When someone asked why, he simply replied, "It felt wrong to leave it behind." The museum still has it, locked inside a small glass display case. An ordinary cream-colored telephone. No plaque tells the full story, just a tiny label that reads, "Donated anonymously. Winter, 1998. Most visitors walk past without a second glance. It's only an old telephone, nothing more." But every Christmas, when the museum closes for the evening, the night security guard makes one last round before locking the doors. He always pauses for a moment beside that display, not because he expects anything to happen, but because once many years ago, just as the lights were being switched off, he could have sworn he heard it ring. Only once, softly, as though someone, somewhere, was simply calling to say they had finally made it home.